This is Jarvis Williams, and I'm going to begin my presentation on my area of study. I'm going to start with sharing my screen and giving you a little bit of what I've been researching. Okay, so my area of study is about discipline in general, and how we've looked at this from both a school as well as a legal aspect. Narrowly speaking, my topic is school administrators must change current school policies and practices that are widening the school to prison pipeline by eliminating exclusionary discipline practices, including school suspensions altogether. Now, just a definition, the word discipline is from the Latin word disciplina, meaning instruction and training, and it is derived from the root word discern, which is to learn. I'd like to start with that definition because a lot of times what we've seen in in regards to student discipline uh, doesn't lean on the side of instruction or learning, but looks like something completely different. And that's why I chose this area of study. What do we mean by exclusionary discipline? This is an umbrella term. Exclusionary discipline practices that can be defined as removing students from typical instruction or a social environment for a period of time in response to unwanted student behavior. One researcher, Klein, he found that research shows exclusion from school is closely linked with academic failure, dropout, and involvement in the juvenile justice system. Simply stating, when students are not in school, they're not learning. Makes sense. And so this is what we talk about when we talk about exclusionary discipline. It's really all of these practices of removing students from school. I like to use an example to understand this, right? It's like, imagine a patient is in the hospital and they are completely irate and outrageous, fighting staff, doing all kind of crazy things, breaking windows. And the nursing staff says, you know what? Bring this patient back when they're ready to learn. That is what we see in schools. And we know in the hospital setting, it's outrageous. Just in the academic setting, it should also be outrageous. So, what is the school to prison pipeline? When we look at exclusionary discipline, these things affect marginalized students because of the school to prison pipeline. And you see this image here where students are literally walking on the school bus and leaving in prison uniforms because our schools are contributing to this phenomenon. One researcher defines this as a complex phenomenon involving many different stakeholders, including students, parents, community members, teachers, administrators, school resource officers, police departments, the juvenile justice system, the adult criminal legal system, and the boards of education. So all of these forces coming together, which are creating these barriers for many students, oftentimes marginalized in the research talks, particularly about Black and brown boys. Now, some of the research, I use this image here of this iceberg because we're not going to get into some of the specifics and some of the harmful effects of exclusionary discipline, as well as the school to prison pipeline. But this iceberg image here just reminds us that we're just kind of scratching the surface where you see the what's on the surface, that's about 10%, and then underneath is 90%. So there's all of these compounding factors as it relates to this broad topic. Some data from the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights note that students with disabilities are more than twice as likely to receive an out-of-school suspension than students not. And while Black students represent 16% of enrollment, they represent 27% of students referred. And so these are just some of the stats, but there are tons of stats that show the harmful effects of exclusionary discipline and how Black students in general are receiving harsher and more severe penalties as relates to discipline in schools. So we talk about how this intersects with the law. And this has been litigated time and time again, and many student plaintiffs have sued in courts against school districts and the boards of education, but they found very little success. There's three areas here where students have gone after. Number one is the Equal Protection Clause and the 14th Amendment, which holds the students have a right to equal protection under the law. This was a case in Goss v. Lopez, 1975, where the Supreme Court held that due process is simply means giving oral or written notice to students for charges against them. So that argument has not worked for students when they say that this is a due process violation and that they're being deprived of life, liberty, or property rights as education has been defined. Number two is the strict scrutiny argument. Strict scrutiny is a heightened standard wherein the courts require under strict scrutiny that plaintiffs be that a law or policy must be narrowly tailored. And so in Washington v. Davis, 1976, it showed that the heightened scrutiny, it does not apply if a non-racially motivated actions, they produce a disparate impact on the education opportunities. So it doesn't matter about the impact if the law or policy itself was not racially motivated when it was written. And so that really closed the gap there. Lastly, many plaintiffs have tried under Title VI violations. Title VI of the Constitution requires that their plaintiffs be given an opportunity to prove that where they have been affected as it relates to race, class, and many other protected categories. In Sweets v. Child, the court did not find that the statistically disproportionate punishment was a result of the requisite discriminatory intent. And they held something interesting here is that discipline matters are really for local school authorities. And the courts have cited this case time and time again, where they say they are not going to interfere in these things and they defer to school authorities. And so that is where we come in and say, what are school administrators going to do? Because there's little protection and have been little success in the courts in interpreting these policies and procedures that are disproportionately affecting certain groups of students. What is the implication? There's going to be a lot of pushback. A policy like this is very broad and very sweeping. And one scholar noted that when you don't have race-neutral policies, they're not as effective. And so there's also a correlation between the treatment of minoritized students in school and incarceration rates. I use this image on the left to see what are we talking about. Just as we know what the image of equity is in the middle, what we're talking about here is the liberation image on the right. Just take down the fence, right? We keep trying to do different things to level the playing field and things like this. But what happens if we remove school suspension and exclusionary discipline altogether? There's going to be pushback and there's going to be a lot of, heated conversations, I think, on both sides of that. So what is the recommendation? I use this image of Ruby Bridges here because it just shows what resilience looks like, right? There's going to be people say, this is impossible. This is not how things are done. A lot of the arguments are about safety, but some of the research shows this is not really about safety. And so just as schools had tough decisions as it relates to new policies regarding segregation and desegregation, and even most recently in COVID, they rose to the occasion very quickly. And so schools were not happy. A lot of schools were not happy with desegregation. And so this image just underscores that. Schools may not be happy with a strong policy that says there's no more exclusionary discipline. But guess what? They'll figure it out. They'll figure it out just like they did with desegregation, just like they did with COVID policies and anything else. That's what educators do. They figure it out and they try to do things differently. But this is something that has to be taken as an adaptive challenge, meaning that you've got to have the people that are involved that are working together, and then you've got to go very slow, right? It's important that public relations are covered and that it's very transparent with the public, and that, as Khalifa noted, trying to develop something without a trusted relationship can cause more harm than good. So this is a policy that must be brought with very slowly, very intentionally, but with fidelity as well, with as many stakeholders involved from start to finish. How do we measure success? I use this image of a quote from Dr. King, right? This is the whole point, that one day that we want the framers to live out the true meaning of his creed, that we hold these truths to be self-evident. And we'll see this when we see the proportionalizations, when we actually get to this place, as we saw from Dr. King, and hopefully through the use of the courts with better policies administered by school administrators that are doing things differently. Okay, so the question is, how do we do things differently? How do we minimize the pockets of inequity and instead proportionalize decisions to reflect the reality and the present needs of the most vulnerable? That is the hope, and that is the goal. Thank you for your time, and I will stop there.